Hey gang, today we're going to look at the kind of minimal viable code to get communication going between an iPhone app and an Apple Watch app. We're also going to talk about how do we build Apple Watch apps. So up until this point, we've been doing minimal stuff around Apple Watch, things like Swift UI and stuff like that, which is very powerful and frankly is probably the future of Apple Watch apps. However, kind of the place that Apple Watch came from before there was such thing is Swift UI is one of the things we're going to look at today. And Swift UI's implementation on Apple Watch is still relatively limited. It's just limited to the app itself. If you want to do things like complications, which are very powerful, complications are the little doodads that show up on the watch's kind of home screen that is configurable by the user. So there's all these little slots that complications can sit into, so you can do things like show the weather and whatnot on the watch face adjacent to the time. If you want to do that kind of stuff, you got to use the kind of things that we're talking about today. So it's a little bit beyond Swift UI. I should also point out that what we're going to look at is actually kind of the second thing in a kind of a 3 iterative stages for how Apple Watch apps have kind of evolved over time. So Swift UI is the new hotness. Before that is the stuff we're going to look at today. And there was even a thing before what we're going to look at today that was pretty janky. And so what we're going to look at today is relatively powerful. It still uses Swift, but not quite Swift UI. It uses something analogous to storyboards, and it's going to look pretty familiar to you if you think about how you use storyboards with Swift. It's basically the same workflow. There's a handful of little gotchas and that sort of thing. A key thing to remember when it comes to a watch is that watch is not very powerful. There's not a lot of onboard memory. There's not a lot of onboard storage, and the battery is horrible. And the processors are okay, but you can't do a ton of work on Apple Watch. There's not going to be graphically intensive games or whatever because it's a little itty bitty screen. B, that same screen gets touched on, and so that you got these giant fat fingers interacting with this itty bitty screen. So you can't really do a ton on the itty bitty screen because you got to remember the fingers are going to be covering the screen most of the time that they're using it anyway. The other issue with Apple Watch is that the battery is tiny. It's just a little teeny thing on your wrist. You got to have, in order to have a pretty rich and strong battery in there, you can't really fit it. And so Apple's taken a lot of really smart deviations that you would kind of expect from something more powerful and long-lasting like the phone in the watch. So for instance, the watch will turn off after a certain amount of time, and there's other kind of power-saving methods that the watch uses that will just kind of complicate things a little bit. However, in the spirit of minimal viable code, we're going to look at what's just the bare minimum that you need to know to be able to send data from iPhone to Apple Watch. And this is super useful. You could do things like update status on the watch and that kind of stuff from the phone. And so setting this just little bit of data, this is a small amount, a little kind of minimal viable code so you can get a sense of how this communication process works. Obviously, you need to build this up into a more robust app, but this is just a taste, a little sample. So we're going to go into Xcode and create a new project. We're going to build an Apple Watch app, but we're going to make sure that we also have the iOS app along with it. So I want this one right here. I'm going to give this a name. MVC, minimal viable code, not model view controller. And then we're going to give it a language. Make sure that Swift is selected. And make sure that the user interface is set to storyboard. If you have been working in Swift UI, this may have changed. So make sure that's set to storyboard. And if you ever in the future think that you're going to want to build a complication for this app, so in other words, you can see those little widgets adjacent to the time or what have you on the Apple Watch face, you want to make sure that this is checked so that all that stuff gets bundled up as well. Hit next. Save it someplace. And here we go. And you're going to remember that, like the previous projects we'd use Apple Watch, it's going to have a little extra Apple Watch stuff down here. And then up at the top here is the iPhone app. We're going to start with the iPhone app. And one of the things we got to build right out of the gate between these two apps is a bridge, a way to send information between the two. And this bridge is not super reliable. So if the Apple Watch is turned off or asleep, this message might not get through. It also doesn't get sent instantaneously. It's going to throttle the communication depending on how available the watch is, or so it doesn't use up resources too much. It's also going to be sent over Bluetooth, which is quick but not instantaneous. And so some of these communication things are just a little bit weak. Instead of thinking of it as like a telephone line connection, it's probably a little bit more like that thing you used to do as a kid where you have a tin can and a string and another tin can. It's a little bit closer to that when it comes to communication. All right, so what I'm going to do is start with the view controller for the iOS app. I'm going to give myself a little bit more room here to work. And inside of this, we need to start out with something very simple, which is I don't want to just have UIKit. I also want to import watch connectivity. And watch connectivity is just what it says in the tin. It enables connectivity to and from the watch. We're only going to have a to, but you can very easily have a from. So we're going to send information to the watch, but we can also have the watch impact the iOS app as well. We'll look at that at some other time. Okay, so once we've imported the watch connectivity, we're going to make it so that this watch can, or this iOS app can send messages to the phone, or to the watch rather. And to do that, we need to enable watch connectivity sessions. A session is that bridge. And so just to get that going, we're going to add this to our view to load. What this is saying is checking to see, hey, is there a watch connectivity session and is it supported? In other words, do you have a watch, all that kind of stuff. And if it is, if all that is all set up and we're ready to rock, then execute all this stuff. And one of the things it's doing here is first creating something called the watch. It's naming the session, a default version of it. And then we're checking to see the delegates, so the stuff that, just like a delegate in real life, where you have a delegate between different countries, we have a delegate between these two different things, and we're saying, hey, this right here, this view controller, it is going to be that delegate. And then once that session is all of our, everything's buttoned up around it, we're going to go ahead and turn it on, activate it, and that's what's happening in line 21. Now, right out of the gate, you can see I'm getting an error message. What this is saying is, hey, this view controller that you have here, it hasn't been declared as something that can be a WatchKit session delegate. What's awesome about Xcode is that we don't need to write any more code. We can just hit a fix button. And kablamo, it adds that little bit that will fix it. And so this enhances it adds superpowers to the view controller. So now the view controller is not just a UI view controller, but it also is a WatchKit session delegate. And then we get another stop sign. And what this is saying, hey, if you want to do a WatchKit session delegate, there's all these additional bits and blobs that you got to add. So if you want to add this superpower, you got to be able to engage in those things. And again, what's awesome about Xcode, I can just hit fix, bloop, and it adds all these things. And we'll walk through what each one of these do. We're not going to actually do them yet, or do anything with them yet, but it's important to understand what each one of these do. So this is activating the session, or kind of controlling what happens when the session is activated. This is what happens when it becomes inactive. In other words, something like the watch might turn off, that kind of thing, or the user walks away from their watch, they put it down on their desk and they walk away, or similar things happening here. We're not going to do anything with these for now, so I'm just going to delete the little code hints. I'm going to leave these behind, but they are there just because you have to make this WC session delegate has to conform, and that includes these things. Instead, what I'm going to do is add a very simple little bit to everything. And this little simple bit to everything will make it so that we can send some information to the watch. And so before we go doing about doing that, we need to build a function that will enable sending information from the phone to the watch. And so I'm going to create a new function, and I'm going to name it send watch message. You can name it anything. And then I'm going to give it a variable that I can send stuff to. So there might be all kinds of information I want to send to the watch, but this one is going to send a string, and I'll just call it a message to send. And inside of this, I'm going to add this code right here. What it's going to do is check to see if the WatchKit session is active, and you can do all the things to it. And then if it is, go ahead and send a message over that session. So first, we're going to check to see if the session is live. And if the session is live and as everything's working, I'm going to go ahead and create a message. This is important. What this is going to do is create a variable that we're just going to use temporarily called message. It's going to get confusing because I'm using the word message all over the place, but we can call it anything. We'll call it donkey just so we can keep track of it. This is the variable that's going to hold the message I'm going to send. And then you can see that when you send messages over to the watch, this is kind of a gotcha. You don't just send a variable over there. You just have to bundle it up inside an array. That enables you to send multiple things over at the same time. For now, we're just sending one thing. And what we're sending is a name value pair. So the name of the message is message, and the value is message to send. And then we can just quickly send the message. What's awesome about WatchKit session is all this is handled for us. We don't need to do a lot of other dancing around to make it work. I'm going to clear out some space for me. But what this is going to say is, hey, go and grab that WatchKit session, that default one that we have all set up, and send a message through it. And what message do you want to send? I want to send the message that I've constructed right above. So we renamed that donkey. I want to send this message right here. And then when the message gets sent, what do you want to have happen? That's the reply handler. We don't need to worry about that right now. So all I'm going to do is make it so when you tap on a button in the iOS app, it sends a message to the watch, and then the watch will display that message. Very simple, but you could use this for any kinds of things. If you were to make it so that if the user kind of changes some settings inside of the phone, it sends a message over to the watch to update things according to those settings, etc. All right, so now I have all the groundwork done. I've established that we have a WatchKit session. We've created that bridge, and now we're able to send messages over it, but we haven't sent any messages yet. So let's make it so that we can send a message. And so I'm going to get out of my code and into my storyboard. And I'm just going to have a very simple button. That didn't go where I wanted it to go. And this is just going to be like a send. This is going to be a send message button. And I don't know what we'd want to send over to the Apple Watch app, but let's just, for fun, make it so the user can type in something. So we'll just have a little text field around that send message. And we'll make it so whenever you type into this text field, you hit send message, whatever you had typed gets sent over to the watch. Let's tie these things together with our code. So I want to be able to create an outlet here so that I can reference this thing. So this is an outlet, and I'll call this like user input message. And then the button itself. This is an action. We'll call it send message button. All right, and that's all I need to do in my storyboard, so I'm going to put that away and just look at my code, make things a little bit nicer, a little bit easier for me to work with because I don't have all that extra stuff turned on. Okay, and now when I want to send the message, it's really easy. I'm just going to create a little variable that's like message to send, and it's going to be whatever the value of user input message, whatever the text had been typed into. And then let's go ahead and send our message. And so what this will do is just run this code right here, pass in whatever the user typed into there, and it's saying, uh-oh, there's a problem. So we just need to make it so that it has to be there. And I will promise this is valid. Now, obviously in real life would need to do a little bit more testing, but this is good enough for our purposes for a minimal viable code perspective, and let's test it. Now this is not going to work really well because we haven't actually done anything with the watch side, but I'm going to go ahead and test the phone side of the equation, run it. And it looks like it's ready to rock. So I can just have users type in this into here. All right, and you can see down here in my console, I'm getting an error message, which is exactly what I would expect, which is saying like, hey, that session you're trying to establish, it's not working because the Counterpart app is not installed. You haven't done anything with the app yet for the watch. No worries. Let's go ahead and switch gears and take a look at the watch. So down here, interface controller.swift is the analog to view controller.swift. It's very similar. There's important distinctions, but if I look at it, you'll see that it looks kind of similar to what you'd expect from on the other side. So there's things like awake. Awake is similar to view load. It's different. There's important distinctions, but those are just going to get in the way of us doing our work right now. And we'll do most of our work inside of the awake function. Okay, so first we need to do the same thing that we did on the iPhone side, which is import the watch connectivity. Next, we're going to go into will activate. I spoke earlier. Awake is not the analog to view to load. Will activate is, my bad. And what we're going to do is the same kind of testing that we had done before on the iOS side. In fact, it's literally the same code. What this is going to do is do the exact same thing. It's going to check to see if WatchKit sessions are supported. If they are, establish that connection, make it so that this interface controller, which is very similar to a view controller, make sure that this interface controller can be the delegate to mediate the interaction, and then activate that session, make it live. Get the same type of error message that says, hey, this is not one of those things. Do you want to add the things? Yes, I do. And right there, it adds it. And the same type of error message. Hey, if you're going to have a WatchKit session delegate, you need to have all the other stuff. Do you want to add the other stuff? Yes, I do. And there we go. We have all the other stuff. And so now what we need to do is make it so that, hey, I've made a connection. I was going to clean this up. We're not going to do anything with this session quite yet. Now what I'm going to do is make it so that I can receive information from the iPhone and do things with it. And to do that is I'm going to add this code. Right out of the gate, this looks very similar to this right here, but it's different. This is calling the session, but I only want to deal with when I've received a new message, and that message will be called message. And so inside of this code, inside of these squirrely brackets, anytime that I use the word message, that's in reference to the message has been received from the iPhone. Okay, so now I'm going to do the same type of workflow that I've done in the iPhone, which is, hey, I got all the Swift code lined up. I need to go actually have some way to show that to the user. So right now we can receive a message, but we need to show it to the user. So what we're going to do is jump over to the storyboard for the watch, add a label, and just make it so that when they receive a message, it changes that label to whatever the message was. You can see here, interface.storyboard, that's similar, not the same, but similar to the idea of main.storyboard in our iOS app. And I click on it, you'll see some important distinctions. There's all this other stuff. This is all related to notifications, if you want to customize that and all those kinds of things. These are very valuable, important things. We're going to ignore them for now. Instead, we're going to zoom in right here to interface controller. This is the thing that is controlled by this Swift code. And so what I'm going to do is go into my interface controller and add a label. Important thing about storyboards in Watch that's very different than storyboards in iOS. In iOS, you can drag and drop these things wherever you want inside of that screen. In Watch, it just stacks them on top of each other. So you could see I drug that label kind of randomly into the screen, but it snapped it to the upper left-hand corner of the Watch. You can't really control those things. There's some ways around it. We're not going to get into them. Instead, just know that the Watch is relatively limited. You can basically just stack elements on top of each other and next to each other. All right, so I have a label. Sweet. Now let's tie this into the interface controller in the same way that I would tie it into a view controller. I'm going to give myself a little bit more room. Holding down Control. And this is an outlet. And I can give this outlet whatever I want. We'll call this label message. And so now, anytime I reference label message, I'm going to be talking about that WatchKit interface label. So that label is sitting over there in the storyboard. Let's tie these two things together and make it so that when you can actually display the information. So when the message has been received, I want to update that label with whatever the message is. So that's the label message that I just set up. And normally I would do .text if I was in iOS. It doesn't work. Inside of WatchKit, everything, you got to be a little bit more explicit. You're not modifying attributes, you're running functions on these objects, and so, or running methods on these objects. And so instead of saying .text, I have to say set text. And you can probably guess what the analog is if you want to get the text out. Instead of set, it's get, but we're not going to do that. We're going to set the text when the message gets sent over. And what do you want to do with it? I want to change it to whatever message was. However, message is not just a normal variable. Remember, message is an array. And so I want to get the value that's been named message. And I want to treat it as a string. And I promise it's going to be a string. Okay, so just to recall what's happening here, let's take a look at the iPhone app version. So remember, in the WatchKit app, we're getting out of the message an array, and we're looking up the element in the array that's been named message. Let's go ahead and swing back over. It's called message because I gave it that name right there. Okay, let's do two things. Let's run the iOS version of the app. Running, great. Let's also run the Watch version of the app. So here's my little label. Oh, need to rerun my iOS version as well. And here's my app, my Watch app. I type a message in. I hit send. And it updates. Awesome. Now we have minimal viable code on how to send messages from the iPhone to the Apple Watch. And you can do anything with this inside of the Apple Watch because Apple Watch is, a real deal platform that can do real deal things. So there you go. I hope that's helpful, and go and make great things.